Great. Thanks, Darren. I don't know why, as I stood up here hearing that the questions were mounting, I got this absolute urge to run out of the room. But so just to share a bit, if anybody wants to stand up and have a stretch or anything, because I know we've been in here for quite a bit in the morning, that's fine, so feel free to do that over the course of the talk. I'm conscious, usually I find myself in last speaker quite a bit, and I'm between people and their food. I'm kind of like that as well, but I'm actually more aware now that I'm between the question and answer session. But I hope you'll bear with me just for a little while, even though we're gone a little bit into the Q&A time, because I'm hoping to move into some material, particularly around some of my perspectives and that on the Consent Declaration Committee, that hopefully will start to get into some of the stuff that you were going to be asking in the Q&A session anyway. I'm going to absolutely fly through and actually skip some of the first few slides, but it is just really important for me to say that with my Department of Health hat on, it's really, really important as we face into the health system and work with our research system. We're at that intersection, really committed to building and sustaining and growing our health research system. We have a long way to go still in relation to that, I think I'd be the first to admit. But this is really the backdrop for our I suppose, steer and role in this. And there's lots of roles that government plays and the Department of Health needs to play in terms of driving the research system and the health research system. And God knows we probably haven't done enough of that over the years, and we're behind, and I'll touch on some of these, hence the further policy considerations. Not for any minute pretending that the landscape out there is absolutely perfect to support all of you with some of the issues you're grappling with. And so I'll touch on that a little later. But we have an absolute clear and a critical role in relation to the stewardship and governance function, particularly in this area, because as Murish and all of others have touched on, trust, public understanding, support, engagement, it's absolutely critical to everything that we do. I think in the research system, in the health research system, if I look at this trustometer, it's high. We want to keep it there. We want to keep going in that direction. I probably wouldn't say the same thing in relation to the trustometer in relation to health and social care services. And we've a lot to learn in relation to that. But again, this is all at the intersection of that, and it's really important that we don't damage that. Just a personal reflection, I suppose, over the last 9 months or so, maybe less, that have sort of been involved in this, is that I suppose I got the feeling, Christ, I've been here before. And I'm sure I've been grappling with the legal and ethical considerations to do with consent, with privacy. You know, why am I not crystal clear on all these issues? Why are there so many questions out there? And I suppose I was particularly struck by the fact that literally 1 decade ago in 2008, myself and Maura Heine from the Health Research Board were sitting across from Asim Sheikh from UCD at the time, writing guidance, 134 pages we put out into the system around trying to explain the Data Protection Acts, 1988 and 2003. 134 pages trying to detail the courts, the common law, all of the ethical standards and how it all comes together. I'd recommend, actually, it hasn't lost any of its pertinence and timing. And actually, it reminded me, as Cathal and others were saying, how little has actually changed in the GDPR and actually all of the language and the issues we were actually talking about in 2008. However, the system was equally confused, concerned, and in a sense paralysed at that time, which is why we did that guidance. So I absolutely appreciate the interest, and we're committed to trying to work through this together. And in particular, I just want to take 2 minutes less to read out the quote from the foreword of that report, because I think it goes to the heart of what we're talking about today, and the same message exists. Asim said in the foreword, "Many have expressed the concern that a zealously over-regulated and bureaucratic regime will hamper medical research." That's predominantly what the HRB funded at the time, and hence medical research and public health was what the report looked at. It is hoped that the conclusion of the document, back in 2008, will demonstrate that while the DP Acts may bring some inconvenience and some bureaucracy, to the practice of medical research and public health, that in fact they do not hinder, but rather encourage a regime of transparency and the provision of greater information to participants and patients. That is hoped will ultimately ensure that medical research has a solid future. So I think it's just interesting to reflect on that back in 2008. It doesn't solve all of the issues and the questions and so on that you have today, but I suppose what one reflection is, the world didn't end. Medical research didn't end. It was at a period of flux and change at the time. Look at it now, it's continuing to do so. And I think those are the issues that we continue to engage with. So this is an ongoing dialogue and discussion. I think the other reflection that I would make that has really struck me in the last number of months is, as researchers, and if I speak with my previous researcher hat on, we talk a lot about projects. A research project, the grant funding. We have to move, and this is why the institutions and other actors and our centres have to be part of this movement. This is not project by project. There is a data life cycle in research that goes far beyond what you might normally think of in terms of your research project. I'm struck by, we think of consent often as our recruitment. Something we do at recruitment. We get access to patients, we recruit them, great, so I'm up at my sample size. But that world has changed. A lot has changed in the last 10 years since 2008, as others have expressed. And you know, it is very useful information on the UK Data Archive website on this issue. But, you know, now you're working on things well beyond your funding is gone. That may actually be one of the difficulties you have at the moment. You think, who am I going to get to do this? You have follow-up projects. Other people reuse your data. You may even add to your data through another project. You may lodge it in another database or portal, and we've got so much material online. So I guess we acknowledge all of that, but recognize when you're thinking about consent for your project, you need to think and get others to help you think way, way beyond that into the cycle. And I suppose the one thing that I find myself repeatedly explaining to people is it's beyond the collection phase and providing the, you know, the information to recruit. Think as storing that data. If it's still identifiable, you are processing or somebody else is processing that information. So people go, well, my project is ended, do I need to reconsent? Well, if you're still storing and it's identifiable, yes, you do, or you need, if you had got consent, to make it anonymous to anonymous. So I think it's just worth spending a little bit of time on that, because I think we need to shift the lens through which we've been looking at this. So I'm mostly going to now talk about circumstances where consent cannot be obtained. And this, again, talking about things that have lasted a couple of decades, this is something that we've been consistently talking about in the Department of Health. If I go back to that report in 2008 in the HRB with Asim Sheikh, there was actually a recommendation in that report recognising that consent was the default for health research, but urging at that time the Department of Justice and the Data Protection Commission to publish legislation that would recognise and provide a mechanism for consent exemptions in research in limited circumstances. So here we are again 10 years later. We picked that up in the Health Information and Patient Safety Bill, which hadn't progressed. But when the Data Protection Act came along and GDPR, it was an ideal opportunity to actually move on something that we've been talking about for the last 10 years and more, and which researchers have been talking to us about. So we then started to look at, well, what do they do in other countries? And I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail, and part of me including this is so that you can actually take a look at their websites and look at it. Some of the reviews that are conducted to basically do a review of, does the public benefit of the health outcomes of that particular research endeavour outweigh the fact that you cannot get consent. In England and Wales, Murta's already talked about this, the Confidentiality Advisory Group, or CAG, which sits in the Health Research Authority over in England, and that came into force under the NHS Act, not under the Data Protection Act. The Privacy Advisory Committee in Northern Ireland. There's a Public Benefit and Privacy Panel in Health and Social Care in Scotland. So they're independent groups. Other countries, for example, I've picked Australia as an example of this, work through Section 95 and 95A of their Privacy Act, but their funding council, the equivalent of the HRB, generated enforceable guidelines that recs enforce in relation to privacy, and they were resourced accordingly to have the expertise on those. In Canada, it differs depending on where you are. Interestingly, in British Columbia, in Canada, they've actually recently changed from their review of the privacy considerations and the public benefit from research ethics committees, because research ethics committees were finding it really, really challenging, and there were huge inconsistencies within that state, and they've actually recently established a data stewardship committee. So our starting point, to be absolutely honest, in an ideal world would be to wrap around our research ethics committee system. And that may be in time where we may go with this in terms of the review, the efficiencies, and so on. However, we do not have, and I'll touch on this at the end, a structured national statutory system for research ethics committees. To be honest, in the department, we don't know how many ethics committees are. We know the 12 that are approved for Clinical Trials Directive. So being very blunt, there wasn't a chance in hell of us writing this regulation through working through recs. And I'll come back to that again, because we can't just leave that there, because research ethics committees, but even more importantly, the members and the intellectual capital and the passion and the commitment of people who are on those committees is absolutely key to making this a success, whether we have an independent committee or not. And hopefully that will come through. I'm not going to run through, therefore, what we envisage, because it's very clear what we envisage for our consent declaration committee. The key point for me is that within that review, this committee will support the direct involvement of members of the public in the review, the scrutiny, and in the decision making. And I think that's a really, really good thing, and builds on all of the excellent work that has been going on around public and patient involvement through patient representative groups and so on. So I think that is absolutely excellent. And in parallel, like I said, I think we need to be going back and taking a look at our ethics committees. I'll put these in as a reminder, but I'm not going to labour on them at all. Probably not at all if they don't come up. To remind you, look at, it's not just us saying that we need to maintain trust. We're not just saying that it's a good thing and that we think patients and the public want to know where their personal information is going from and going to, and who it's been shared with. We've had reports going back many years. I've only picked out a sample from my POSI in 2009 saying people are confused generally by clinical research anyway. They're hugely supportive, but they do want to know what their information is being used for and in what format. And when they do know that, a huge percentage, vast majority, are willing to participate and to continue participating. Similarly, some really good work done back in 2011 down in Galway by Anne McFarlane and Andrew Murphy and the team down there, taking a look at attitudes of people coming into general practice, one of the most trusted areas, I think, for the public, and saying, that we're happy for our anonymous information to be shared for the purposes of research. We get the common good. We're very supportive of this, but we do want to know basic information, and we do want to be asked. Not necessarily asked for every single study, and we can touch on that again, I think, probably when we get into the questions. Do you have to do it for every study, or that notion of ongoing consent and contact with people. And I've just given an example. It's not just in Ireland. If I look at Scotland, in the whole area of data sharing and data linkage and so on, very similar. People said, it's not unconditional. We are very supportive, but we do want to know who's involved, what's it for, and in particular, this very recent, it was published in 2018, basically the two most conditional factors in it, I should have highlighted them, were whether private or commercial interest is involved, to what extent, and if there are profits, how are they managed and shared? And very interestingly, the public really want to know that any profits go back into research, which was interesting, and who is overseeing the process. So they were the two. It's a very interesting report. I would encourage you to read it. So that's really important, the backdrop to this. So we call it consent declaration. You will also read consent waiver, consent exemption, but basically it is saying that the public interest is deemed to outweigh the need for a particular time, for a particular thing, to getting the explicit consent of the data subjects. So I suppose in terms of trying to put a bit of practical meat on the bones to pick up on the list of things that you would be expected to send in to this consent declaration committee, I thought, look, we're modelling a lot of what we're doing on the CAG in the UK, in England, not completely because we are different, but there's a lot that we can learn. And thankfully, even if you think like we're going slower than you would like us to go, we'd be a hell of a lot slower if we didn't have very collaborative and engaged people in places like the CAG to work with us. So I just thought, and I would encourage you to look at their website and to look at their application forms. They've all their minutes, they've all of their decisions. So if you really want, even though I'll try and touch on one or two examples here, if you really want to know what type of things actually send to the CAG, what's the case, very detailed minutes setting out what they looked for, what the decision was and why. But the review, and I guess this is probably me indirectly, like, you know, buying myself time in particular for not having a committee here to point to you at this point in time. It's not a trivial undertaking, and there's quite a lot of technical and perspectives, including lay perspectives, that's really, really critical to ensure that we have the review and do honour to what we're trying to do here. So they ask what, when, why, who, generally in relation to the research. Quite a large section on the public interest, as you can imagine, because that has to trump everything else. The practical and practicable alternatives. You have to show that you have ruled out every other alternative to disclosure of identifiable data without consent. And you can see the various other issues that are there. A favourable rec opinion is part of the application pack. So this committee is not replacing the rec review, which we would expect to occur and to happen as it has always done. And you actually need a favourable rec review. You need PPI inputs and views. And actually, that in particular is important to making the case for your public interest argument. The committee doesn't really, it's important, and it will listen to what you have to say as the principal investigator or the data controller, but it would be really great if you have run a focus group or a community group or something like that with people who are representative of the population or subpopulation that you're looking to engage in your research. That's a very compelling argument. And importantly, it looks always for an exit strategy. And some of the examples that I'm just going to touch on might show that. So as Ruth said, it's not a time unlimited, and it's often for one part of your research project. So it's not like you get a decree for the entire project, but there's usually one bit, like, oh, I have to try and consent them, or I have to try and find them to even consent them. It's those types of issues that you're getting into when you get into the CAG. And again, I'm not going to go through this, but you will see on the CAG website in England, they've actually, because they've been in existence for about 20 years now, they've actually subdivided their applications up into their kind of precedent categories, as it were. So again, it's really, even flicking through them, you start to get a flavour for the types of things that tend to come in. So participation, participant identification for screening to identify people who you may wish to involve in a study. That's not just a given that you do that, but if the numbers are so large, if there's lots of sites and you can make a case for the public benefit, there is an application stream for that with them, and we'll touch on that a little later, particularly where the screening cannot, really what you're claiming is it's so large that the direct care team couldn't possibly do all of that. And that's essentially what you're making the case for, is somebody to be given access to the identifiable information who's not actually a routine member of the direct care team. That is usually, and in GDPR, that's not allowed. So you're actually looking for a temporary time limited. You're making a case for that. But you'll see some of the numbers that I'm going to point out in some of the examples. So it's not a small thing. Seeking access in a really unusual, this should be very unusual for somebody to go on site to extract anonymized data. So like I said, if you take a look at their website, some of the stuff is really, really helpful to look at. Record linkage and data linkage studies are probably their most high volume applications there. And that was very much in our thinking when we actually were urging and engaging with the DPC to make a case for needing a mechanism for consent exemptions. So again, useful to look at the findings and so on it. I'm not going to run through these, but conscious that you're going to take the slides away, and I'm very happy to show these. And this is the start of a process of trying to show you some case studies. I've put 3 cases up here. I'm not saying if you have something absolutely identical that the Consent Declaration Committee is going to, because I can't speak for the Consent Declaration Committee, but what I have done is pulled out a couple of instances where others have made cases for declarations or waivers elsewhere, and where it has been found to be approved and the reasons for doing it. So you will see the backdrop, you will see the case made for the waiver, and you won't see things like cost or administrative burden at the top of that, or inconvenience. You will see lots of other issues in there, and then you'll actually see the reasons that were given for granting the waiver. And I know I'm flying through this, but it's really, really important that we start to actually have tangible case studies of the types of things that we're talking about. I've included 2 other there that you can take away. You will see the numbers are large. They have absolutely public benefit. I'm pretty confident that we could all agree, and you can see the rationale given by different committees. These aren't all the UK committees, so I've picked a selection so you can see what they're doing, and I hope that you'll find this helpful. When I said large, I mean in this one, they estimated you'd have to go through 400,000 charts across the whole of the UK in order to identify 12,000 individuals who would then be consented. So it's not that the study isn't going to be one driven by informed consent, but the initial step to do that requested and got the consent declaration. So you can see secondary use of data is going to be an issue in relation to this, and I've given a little bit of guidance in relation to that. Importantly, any request for a consent declaration is highly likely, I would say, definitely be disproved if the original consent actually expressly said that they didn't want their data to be used for any other later purposes. So you can't turn a train around on a track. I'm not going to get into methodological issues here. I don't think it's the issue. But again, for those of you interested, cluster randomized trials are a very common example of the type of study that often needs to require a consent declaration, because by the very nature of it, you're randomizing a study at the level of a community or of a geography, or actually the entire country, if it's something like fluoridation or something like that. So again, you can start to see the types of methodological and other issues that either because of the nature and the scale of it, or getting the initial step done while then moving to informed consent, or a study where you can absolutely say, we've no other choice but to do it in this way. The country and globally, we need this result. And if we were to do an explicit consent, we would actually not make it practically possible to do it in this area. It would invalidate the findings, or it would significantly bias it. That's the type of case that you're making. I'm not going to touch on these because others have. I've just put them up there because they are the questions that are rightly bouncing around. And we will continue to work with you to try and talk these through. But we also need you on the back of today and engaging with what you've heard to try and come up with solutions and answers and your views on this as well. The other thing that I'm not going to talk about, but it would be wrong of me not to acknowledge it, is that there's a whole pile of special things to think about in relation to genome research, not just for the committee, and I have to say that, but for GDPR and the Act, and potentially, in some ways, I know that people are grappling with, well, actually, is that personal information? Is it not? So actually a lot of it is, does it even fall in under needing to go to the committee? What I would say, and maybe we can touch on this later on, and we've engaged just briefly with Cathal in relation to this, is, I mean, if there's a code of practice in this area, if there's discussions happening in Europe, whether it be through BBMRI or others, we absolutely want to be involved in those discussions. We want to be part of that Europe-wide conversation, and actually we don't want to jump too soon and actually putting things definitively down on paper according to Ireland, because we actually want to make sure that in that global endeavour that we fit in with any codes of practice that are emerging. That's not to say we're kicking a can down the road. We'll continue to work with you, and I think it'll be a topic of great concern. My last minute is just to say, well, further considerations. That has left us, rightly so, I think, in the department and in the research community with more homework and more urgency than we started with. In particular, the National Research Ethics System, long overdue. I don't need to convince anybody in here. We are actively working at this moment in time, myself and Peter particularly, to take what was in the Health Information and Patient Safety Bill. We will be putting a memo to government soon requesting that we take the Research Ethics Committee bit, if I can use non-Peter and non-legal lingo, listen to what people said, both the Research Ethics Committees themselves and what was said by Parliament in pre-legislative scrutiny, and put it up to the top of the agenda and join forces with the medicines unit in the department, who are now actively trying to work to get the Clinical Trials Directive for Medicinals product National Research Ethics Committee up by the end of next year. So more on that. What's really clear to me is, as if we didn't realise it already, particularly when we get into data coming together, linking, moving and so on, we need to invest in safe havens. We need to embrace the DAZZLE report that the HRB published a number of years ago, and we need to do that urgently. What makes these applications run pretty, I would say seamlessly, much more seamlessly through the committee in the UK and so on, is they have safe havens, they have NHS Digital, you have the FAR Institute, you have the SAIL Institute, and that from a security, a technical, an organisational, the risk of disclosure, if you have a centre that everybody has confidence in, and that the DPC can go in and the 200 people can blitz around in the next while, well then that makes life easier for all of us. So we have to do that soon. We have to, and we are already ramping up our conversation about where genomics, genomic medicine, biobanking and so on, what is our vision, what are we doing in this country, and where are we going? And finally, my 2 points are, we have to invest in people. This is a new way of thinking. We need jobs for people that actually probably weren't even jobs in universities and organisations before. And we need to build capacity in our DPOs, and we've so much to do in relation to that. So a big to-do list. That's not just for the Department of Health, it's not for the HRB. All of the other funders of research have a role to play in this, and probably any audience that we were talking about, even not health research, I think would say the same thing. And we need to stay connected, and we need to engage in Europe and internationally, because we're not alone. My final 2 slides that I'm only going to talk to bullet points. What are we doing at the moment when we're not trying to grapple with the research ethics issue? We are actively securing and trying to confirm consent declaration committee members. The HRB are far advanced on recruitment of the Secretariat staff, and we're really, really grateful to them. I think we were very, very clear from an early point, having done some visits elsewhere. This was not an administrative Secretariat. This needs technical research and legal skills, because the one thing that we heard back from places that we went were that Secretariat will end up having tons and tons of conversations with people that never actually make it. to the CDC, and we want to be equipped to do that. You can see our logo for our HRCDC and our strapline there by way of saying we do have a website. We will be activating that soon. We're preparing application forms and guidelines. Bear with us, because this is partially when we don't have a secretariat and we don't have a committee, but we're trying to keep moving on it. You're not the only ones who are sort of jogging on the spot and moving a bit one step forward and two steps back in relation to reacting to GDPR and stuff. And we're like that also. But we're moving in the right direction. We're continue to collect queries and provide guidance. One of the immediate actions after this meeting, and it's been long overdue, but we wanted to have a broad-based meeting first. We will try to convene a meeting with anybody from research ethics committees that are interested. Like I said, we don't have the magic list. It's not a group that we have any responsibility over. People, please contact us afterwards if you're on a research ethics committee and you haven't contacted us yet, because we'd really like to discuss how this is going to work from a process, from who does what, how do we interact and so on. And you're absolutely critical to the success of this. We'll continue to have engagement with the DPC around things like retrospective chart reviews, codes of practices and so on. We'd be interested in meeting and perhaps convening a meeting of the DPOs just to build a relationship. I don't even know who many are, and maybe just to get a bit of dialogue going. We're hoping to have the application forms and so on up on the website, and it will be hrcdc.ie. Gillian nods at me. So keep an eye on that, and we will have alerts on the HRB website in relation to that. I'm committed to trying to get the committee to meet together in December. That may not be to discuss applications, but it's certainly they'll need to get to know one another, get to find, get a bit of training, get up to speed and so on. They're going to be representative. I say some will be in this room. So it's not like everybody is going to be an expert the minute they come in the door. So we'll need to do a bit of that. And we're hoping then that the first decisions, which again, in the interest of transparency, will be published for all to see, will be in January or the early part of 2019. And finally, we will continue to engage because we're not sure if we're getting this right. But we know we need a consent declaration committee. It's been long overdue, and we know there's other things that we need to do. And the structure and the process might change in the future if we eventually get our National Research Ethics Committee structure up and running. I want to thank Peter in particularly. He is the workhorse behind this, and in particular thank everybody in the HRB and for example who's been associated with the HRB, because we kind of have landed them with a bit of a poison chalice in some sense, and they took it on because everybody's bought into the vision of why we're doing it. So I would just urge you to be patient, work with us, come to us with solutions, with ideas that are compliant with the principles and the standards and the safeguards set out in GDPR. And I'm sure there's plenty of good ideas out there. So thank you.